I'll go ahead and begin since it seems like we're mostly here. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to tell you about what's coming. I'm sure you are aware that we have Western Seminary students who are interns here at Third. You may not have had a chance to interact with them, though, so we're going to remedy that. Next week, we have one intern, Michael St. Marie, and he will be speaking to us on restorative justice in practice in the early church. And then 2 weeks after that, Joash John, another of our interns, will be speaking with us, so that will be a treat. Today, it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Angela Carpenter as our speaker. You may have noticed in the bulletin it said Angel or Angel, but it's Angela. And you may remember the last time she spoke with us was in conjunction with her new book that was coming out called Grace and Social Ethics. And that book is in our library, and I know some groups have studied it here. Today we're doing a different topic. She's going to be talking about Calvin and the refugees, and maybe even how that might apply to today. Dr. Carpenter, or Angela, as most of us call her, is a member of Third along with her husband and 2 daughters. She's an associate professor of religion, of Reformed theology at Hope College, and she's been in the Department of Religion since 2017. She focuses on Christian theology and ethics, particularly the Reformed tradition. And thank you for being with us today, Angela.
And I were brainstorming about what would be a good topic. I knew I wanted to do something on Calvin because I'm writing a paper on Calvin for a conference this semester, so I wanted to be sure I overlapped some with what I'm already doing. But settled on the topic of the refugee because immigration and conflicts surrounding immigration are, of course, of extreme interest and pertinence at our current cultural and political moment as well. You may or may not know that immigration was a major social phenomenon during the Reformation period as well. So Calvin himself was a refugee, and in fact, I brought this book with me in case anyone wants to look at it afterwards, called John Calvin, Refugee Theologian. It's a really nice introduction to Calvin's theology through the lens of Calvin himself as a refugee and how being a refugee might have influenced his theology. So I'll be drawing on that a little bit as I talk this morning. So Calvin himself was a refugee, and his time in Geneva, which is where he spent most of his life and certainly his career as a pastor and theologian in Geneva, most of his time there was also spent engaging with and addressing problems, crises caused by refugees and immigrants throughout Europe at that time. So I'm going to talk through a little bit of the history here, some of Calvin and the church in Geneva's response to the refugee crisis in the 16th century, and then whether there's anything we can learn from that as we think about our own struggles with immigration and refugee issues. So first of all, okay, that'll disappear, good. Just a little bit of the history and some relevant dates on Calvin and Geneva to provide some context for you. So in the early 1530s, Geneva was part of the Duchy of Savoy, but they gained their independence, which was very much a political and religious shift at the same time. So they gained their independence and declare themselves to be a reformed city, not part of the Catholic Church. The exact dates there are not entirely clear, but that's in the early 1530s. In 1534, you have the Placards Affair in France. So at this time, Calvin is from France, and he's a young man in his 20s, and he is, during the early 1530s, Calvin is learning more about and gaining sympathy for the Reformation movement and becoming more and more committed to it. In 1534, the Placards Affair is a major event in France. So in the middle of the night, people sympathetic to and committed to the reform movement place posters all over France, even including outside the door of the king, which was probably a mistake, because the king wakes up in the morning and sees this, and it's not only subversive in terms of religious movements, but it's also seen as a threat to his security. So the backlash to this movement of posters that were anti-Catholic reform-oriented posters, I think most of them were attacking the Mass in some form or another. There's a strong backlash right away. So known sympathizers to the reform movement were arrested, begin to be burned at the stake, and people who, like Calvin, or other known sympathizers, decide that it is time to leave. So in 1534, Calvin himself becomes a refugee after the Placards Affair and leaves for the Swiss territories, Swiss regions. By the way, the placards thing happens again in 1535. Apparently, they thought that it was still a good idea. So that continued to stir up controversy and backlash and repression in France. So the movement of people leaving France for other places that are reformed territories is going to continue for the next several decades. Meanwhile, in Geneva seizes the former monastic territories and their revenues, and they use these revenues to start a public school and a general hospital. Now, hospital you might associate strictly with medical care. This is actually something that is much broader than simply medical care. So the general hospital, you might think more broadly in terms of providing social services. So housing for people who are maybe disabled or older widows or orphans, as well as providing food for those who are in need, a variety of social assistance kinds of things centered in the general hospital. By the way, this is common in terms of both the Lutheran Reformation and Reformed territories. You're beginning to see a shift in how issues of poverty are dealt with and laying the foundations for what has become the social welfare state that we have today. So moving from a model of begging and giving alms to the poor to having more centralized aid for the poor is a shift that takes place really with the Reformation, and that happens in Geneva too. This is going to be important for what happens later, which is why I have that on here. Okay, so in 1536, Calvin comes to Geneva. Initially, he's just traveling through, but he is persuaded by the head pastor there to stay, and in fact, he's told, you will be basically going against God's will for you, rebelling against God if you don't stay and lead the Reformation. I mean, he really, this guy, he was Guillaume Farel. He was a real firebrand, and he stayed in Geneva with Calvin, which is important because Calvin kind of took on Guillaume Farel's approach to ministry, this kind of hot-headed firebrand approach, and 2 years later, they both get expelled from Geneva. Geneva's like, no, we don't want you. You are too intense, strict in your Reformation agenda, and hot-headed firebrand type, they're expelled from Geneva. Calvin goes to, at this point, I think it is Zurich, but I could be wrong about that. Anyway, he spends a few years being mentored, especially by Martin Bucer and some other Reformation theologians, and he matures a little bit. A few years pass by in Geneva, and they start to realize we really do need some leadership here. So they invite Calvin to come back. Calvin has many other senior reformers who are willing to testify to his maturation during this period. He returns to Geneva in 1538. He returns to Geneva in 1541 as the leader of the church, and then this is where he spends the rest of his career. So this is sort of some background context timeline as we think about the situation with the refugees. All right, So, what's going on with refugees in Geneva? In 1531, as Geneva is gaining its independence, they razed the suburbs around the city. They did this because they're thinking in terms of the safety and integrity of the city. Those suburbs were vulnerable to attack, so they want everyone to be within the city walls. However, this becomes important in terms of the refugee movement because it makes the city itself more populous, more dense, and it heightens the threat that people feel when others are coming in just by scarcity of space and resources. So they end up starting to make buildings taller so they can accommodate more people, and the density inside the city walls just really increases. By 1538, they've established this general hospital. The city of Geneva is pretty small, population 12,000 around this time. And they're having to make difficult decisions about who is going to receive aid from the general hospital, because there are more people who have need than aid available to go around. And this is just native Genevans at this point, so not considering refugees who are coming in from outside. So that's kind of part of the background here. And then in 1538, 1539, over 10,000 refugees pass through the city. So almost the entire size of the city is coming through as refugees in a time where people are already feeling like their own resources are strained, like they don't have the resources to help. To make this even more stressful, in 1540 and 1542, you have famine and plagues. So no similarities that we could draw to our own time in terms of things that might cause social stressors. And at this time in Geneva, the city guard starts to go neighborhood by neighborhood to identify refugees and foreigners who are not able to support themselves and say, you have to leave the city. They say, we will give you some bread for your journey. Oh, and if you stay, we'll torture you. So we care about you, but also we're going to torture you. Again, going neighborhood by neighborhood, armed city guard, casting people out of different residences in the city. Again, I think we can see some parallels to our own time here as well. This is during the time when Calvin is in the city. So as you might imagine, a refugee himself, this is something that he cares deeply about. Calvin is the lead pastor. He's not the civil magistrate. He doesn't have civil authority, although he does have a lot of influence. So he doesn't have the ability to stop this as it is happening, but he is deeply concerned. And in 1545, as there's another effort to expel refugees, Calvin establishes what becomes known as the French Fund. And this is a fund that is dedicated to assisting poor refugees. So let me tell you a little bit about the French Fund. First of all, the initial funding for this came from a wealthy French refugee bequest that he had made in his will. And there were many influential, wealthy people with Reformed sympathies from France who were refugees throughout Europe during this time. So not all refugees were impoverished. Many were highly educated. Many were influential, sort of elite citizens of their day. So one of these has made a bequest, and Calvin uses this to start the French Fund. He establishes deacons, so the office of deacon had sort of fallen into misuse in Calvin's mind in terms of what deacons were meant to do. Drawing on scripture, Calvin thinks that deacons should be dedicated solely to the poor. So deacons are administering the French Fund. And he separates with the French Fund the resources for refugees from the resources that are meant to assist poor native Genevans. And this is a really important move because part of the tension was this conflict over scarcity of resources and people feeling like there's already not enough to help the poor people who are here, and now all these refugees are coming through. What the French Fund allows Calvin and others to do is to relieve some of that pressure, separate the assistance to native Genevans from the assistance for refugees. So this fund continues to be funded in large part by wealthier refugees themselves. So initially, not a lot of native Genevans are really excited about contributing to the French fund, but there are plenty other wealthy French refugees who are in the area who are contributing to it. And eventually, a lot of the proceeds of Calvin's own theological work. So Calvin is a prolific author. You might be familiar with his major theological work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. He wrote commentaries on virtually every book of the Bible. His sermons were also collected and sold, and he wrote other works as well. And so a lot of the proceeds from these sales are also going to support the French Fund. But Calvin is also a pastor, and he is teaching his congregation, and he has a network of pastors working with him. I'll say more about them in a minute, who are teaching the congregation, the Genevans, as well as the refugees, about the theology of exile and homemaking, which I'll say more about in a second as well, but also about the Christian concern for the poor and care for the poor. So actually, by the end of the century, it's quite common for native Genevans as well as those who are of French descent to include refugee funds, the Genevan Hospital, educational institutions in their wills. So by the end of the century, many of the native Genevans have come to become invested in this kind of assistance as well. Kinds of things the French Fund is used for: housing, job training, job tools, medical expenses, money for basic needs, pretty much anything that you can imagine that refugees might need. Many of the refugees are just passing through Geneva, but quite a few do end up staying. So by the end of, I don't know if that was in the last slide or not. Nope, that's coming up in a future slide. But eventually the population of Geneva doubles in size because of the refugees that are coming through. And the French Fund also funds some religious goals as well. So Calvin was very much invested in what was happening in France throughout his life. The Reform movement in France he continued to support, and a lot of the French funds were going to support missions and support for Reformed communities in France as well. Okay, so this is the broad situation here. You have a small town, limited resources, and just for a confluence of events where they are located in the historical situation, they are a hub of refugee activity, and this has created a lot of social tensions. I want to say a little bit more about some of these tensions. First of all, there are divisions between the native Genevans and the political leaders and the religious leaders. So in Geneva, almost all of the religious leaders are outsiders, are refugees, are French. So Calvin himself, a French refugee. Most of the pastors that he brings on board with him are also French refugees. When you think about it, this actually does make sense because Geneva was a small town. It, partially for political reasons as well as religious reasons, becomes a Reformed city rather than a Catholic city. But that switch is not necessarily because the entire city is deeply committed to the Reformed cause. It's in part for political reasons, separating themselves from Catholic territories and creating a distinction there. And it's also, in part, some are motivated for genuine religious reasons as well. But that means that there is not like this groundswell of support for and enthusiasm behind necessarily the theology of the Reformed movement. So when it comes to finding pastors and leaders, people who are well-trained, well-educated, you're not going to find a lot of those in a small town like Geneva. Many of them are going to be coming from outside. So the refugees from France, they have a very different character. So Geneva, the whole city is told, hey, we're Reformed now. And maybe some people are on board with that, but some people are just like, okay, whatever, but they pretty much just kind of keep their Catholic traditions, which becomes a source of tension as well. The refugee community, however, they are refugees because they were deeply committed. They left France because of their religious commitment. So among the refugees, you have a lot more people who are invested specifically in the cause of the Reformation. So many of these do end up being educated and trained to become pastors and teachers in the movement. As you might imagine, this is also going to create some social tension when all of the leaders in the church are of a different ethnicity and background than most of the people in the town, and are much more enthusiastic about their religious commitments than the ordinary Genevan citizen would have been. So this sort of tension between the refugee ministers and church leaders and the ordinary population, as well as the political leaders, is a factor here. By 1557, so another 20 years in the future or so from the time period we were initially talking about, the population of Geneva has doubled in 2 decades because of the refugees. And this is like stable people locating in Geneva. Many, many more have passed through during this time and not located in Geneva, just to give you a sense of the scale here. In terms of the politics, Calvin is accused of supporting immigration for the sake of political support. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Again, so, discerning some common things here. In 1547, Calvin talks about a situation in a letter to a friend of his where these tensions were at the point of boiling over in mob activity and violence, and Calvin talks about stepping into the middle of this situation to diffuse the tensions and get people to report their concerns to proper authorities rather than instigate violent activity themselves. So that's just a small historical indication in a letter of how some of these tensions were manifesting. There are also consistory records. Consistory, this is a word that we use here at Third Reformed Church and other Reformed communities. How many of you are familiar with consistory in Geneva? Is that a term historically that you're familiar with? Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about this. So when Calvin went back to Geneva the second time, when he agreed to come back as head pastor, one of his conditions for going back was that Geneva establish a consistory, which is not just the leadership body of the church, like it is in Reformed churches here in West Michigan, but it was a body that would deal with disciplinary issues within the church. So when it's not a legal situation, but there were other points of conflict or behavior that they felt needed to be dealt with, someone would come before this body, the consistory, to basically talk through what was going on and have words of advice and counsel be offered to them. And sometimes disciplinary measures would be enacted, like someone being restricted from taking the sacraments, for example, might be something that would happen as a result of coming before the consistory. And the consistory would hear all sorts of issues, so marital disputes, spousal abuse, not lackadaisical church attendance would be another. So imagine, again, you have mostly French pastors and then some local leaders as this kind of governing body hearing disciplinary cases of local Genevans who, some of which are very much still attached to Catholic traditions, like they want to name their kids Catholic names, and the Reformation leaders are saying, no, you can't use those Catholic names anymore. And these are the kinds of things that are coming before the consistory. You could see why this would be a body that was, for many ordinary Genevans, very strongly disliked, is maybe putting it lightly. And again, this is part of the tensions as well between the Reformed communities and their enthusiasm for the Reform movement and the native Genevans. So that's the consistory and the background and the tension there. But the consistory records themselves are historically fascinating. They're like this window into the 16th century and what was going on and the kinds of disputes that were coming up. And you see a lot of this tension between natives and immigrants coming up in the consistory records. So, for example, there's one man who comes before the consistory multiple times. Early on, he's coming before the consistory for marital disputes and spousal abuse. And then later, he's coming before the consistory for making really harsh negative statements about the refugees. Interesting to see these kinds of behavioral continuities as well, because I think we observe some of these same patterns in our own cultural context as well. But that's just one example. You have a lot of other just recordings of xenophobic incidences, tension between refugees and native Genevans. And also, as I've said, tensions between the ministers, like Calvin, and the magistrates, the political leaders as well. So there's a lot of tension that Calvin has to deal with. What then is his theological response? I have 4 points here that I'll talk about briefly, and then a few quotes where we can see from Calvin's writing some examples of some of these. First, care for the poor is a constant theme of Calvin's writing and preaching. I think this is actually really important to emphasize because in our environment, I think this is pretty much not the case in contemporary American Christianity. Like, you occasionally hear comments about care for the poor, concern for the poor, but not to the degree if you just sit down and start reading from Calvin's sermons and his commentaries where this pops up all the time. It's really a consistent theme of his writing and preaching. And again, that makes sense when you think about the tensions that he's dealing with, when you think about this massive refugee movement that he's struggling with as well. So that's one point. Another point of emphasis in Calvin's theology that I think is really crucial to theologically dealing with the tensions that he's experiencing is that he has an interdependent anthropology. So this is fancy theological language for just saying his understanding of the human person is not of independence and self-sufficiency, but of interdependence as the core of what it means to be human. So instead of thinking of us each as individuals in the first instant, meant to take care of ourselves first, Calvin's understanding of what it means to be human is of everybody depending on everybody else, of humanity as a unity first, and then individuals apparent within that unity. And this is very much in keeping in Calvin's understanding with Scripture. So think of language about the body of Christ as being analogous to a human body. We get this all the time in the letters of Paul. Can one part of the body say to the other part, "I don't need you"? No, because this is a whole body, and everyone is dependent on and contributing to the whole of the body, and all the different parts matter. So that interdependent anthropology is a regular emphasis of Calvin's thought, and you could see why that might be important in terms of a community, especially a church community, where you have polarized groups who really feel threatened by each other and don't like each other. And I have some examples of this that we'll come back to. He regularly warns against greed and waste. So Calvin does not say that everyone needs to be poor. He doesn't say that everybody needs to give up all of their possessions. However, he does say that generosity is the point of wealth, and that people should live frugally because whatever they have after their frugal living is for the sake of the poor, is for those in need. So he has many, many warnings against greed, against a luxurious lifestyle, and those warnings are usually pretty harsh as well. If you read some of his commentary on the wealthy. And often these are like linked together, the kind of interdependence and the warning against greed and waste. So there's one point, trying to remember if this is in a sermon or a commentary. I can't remember which one it was. But anyway, Calvin is talking about and criticizing wealthy people who want to be independent and want to have everything for themselves, want to continue acquiring more and be independent. And Calvin basically says, these people don't really know what they want. They can't even imagine what it would be like if they actually did have everything for themselves without other people, excluding other people. He's like, who is going to plow your fields? Who is going to, reap the harvest? He's pointing out that the desire to attain more and more for oneself is actually ultimately going to be a liability if you isolate yourself from what you need from other people. The other thing, and this is really strongly presented in Kenneth Wu's book on Calvin, the refugee theologian, is he has this universal theology of exile. And this is something that many of us are familiar with from a variety of Christian contexts. So the idea that our life in the present is a sojourn, that we are experiencing a time of exile in this narrative of sin and rebellion from God, that our current existence is one of exile as well, looking forward to and anticipating a homeland with God in eternity, but there's this moment of exile now. So Calvin uses this theology of exile to make sure that his entire congregation knows they're all really in the same boat. Native Genevans or French, everyone is experiencing a time of exile and displacement. Okay, some examples of some of these. This is from the Institute's Calvin's discussion of the sixth commandment, you shall not kill, which I think illustrates a few of the points that I've mentioned. So I'm just going to read this as you can follow along. Calvin writes, the purpose of this commandment is, the Lord has bound mankind together by certain unity. Hence, each man ought to concern himself with the safety of all. To sum up then, all violence, injury, and any harmful thing at all that may injure our neighbor's body are forbidden to us. We are accordingly commanded, if we find anything of use to us in saving our neighbor's lives, faithfully to employ it. If there's anything that makes for their peace, to see to it. If anything harmful, to ward it off. If they are in any danger, to lend a helping hand. So again, you have this unity of humanity, the interdependence. You shall not kill is not just refrain from even harming your neighbor, but that we all have a unity of humankind, and we all are meant to look out for each other. So actively working for the good of the neighbor is part of the command, you shall not kill. He goes on then to say in the very next section on the sixth commandment, Scripture notes that this commandment rests upon a twofold basis. Man is both the image of God and our flesh. Now, if we do not wish to violate the image of God, we ought to hold our neighbor sacred. And if we do not wish to renounce all humanity, we ought to cherish his as our own flesh. So again, you have this dignity of the human person, he says, comes from being in the image of God, and then also that we all share this one flesh, this one humanity, that kind of interdependence and unity of humanity. So we should see our neighbor as sacred. And you can kind of hear how that would hit differently in a community where you have these ongoing inter-ethnic conflicts. Okay. Last thing that I'll point out here, just because I find this so incredibly striking, especially given Calvin's reputation. You probably have a reputation of Calvin as sort of stern and unfeeling and judgmental and so on and so forth. Part of that is deserved. I mean, his disposition was not particularly warm, you might say. But that's not necessarily fair to say of his theology as a whole. So as he's talking about Christian living in Book 3 of the Institutes, he has this beautiful moment of encouraging empathy. So it's not just that you do the right thing. And here he's criticizing people who give alms to the poor just because they're going to gain something for it. But he says you actually have to feel love for the poor. So first, they must put themselves in the place of him who they see in need of their assistance, and pity his ill fortune as if they themselves experienced and bore it, so that they may be impelled by a feeling of mercy and humaneness to go to his aid just as to their own. He's saying, live out in your mental life this kind of empathy and care for those who are in need, so that you will really feel the desire to help and to care for them. I find this particularly striking. I don't know how many of you kind of keep track of broader Christian trends in the contemporary moment, but there's a segment of contemporary Christianity right now that is writing books called The Sin of Empathy. Have any of you heard of this? And this is a segment of Christianity that often calls itself Reformed and draws on the Reformed tradition. So with that, I think it's really important to emphasize that the earliest Reformers were not taking that approach. In fact, quite the opposite. Okay, I want to be sure to leave some time for questions and conversation. So I'm going to close here with 3 things that I think we can learn from Calvin in terms of thinking about immigration and refugee issues today. First, I think just on a practical level, it was really important that the care of refugees and the care of native poor, because of the French fund, they were able to make those not be in competition with each other. So in Geneva, it was possible, because these were separated, to say we can care both for native Genevans as well as care for refugees, and caring for one is not going to take away from the care for the other. Practically speaking, I just think that was really important. I don't know how it might apply in our own context, although I think it is really important to, and again, this gets back to the empathy, right? To put ourselves, first of all, historically, in the position of the native Genevans who are experiencing, like, as many people in the 2-year period as they themselves are in their town, come through in a serious situation of dire need. And, you know, Geneva's not a wealthy city. This is the 16th century. There is poverty everywhere, and people have their own needs as well. So to really sympathetically enter into that and to imagine how people might genuinely feel threatened, and how this might very reasonably result in, you know, distrust, dislike, even hatred of the outsider. And to think about how, as much as possible, to minimize those kinds of pressures, so people don't feel like one kind of poor is at the expense of another kind of need or poverty. Secondly, there's a theological response that is taking place here. So Calvin's theology of exile is what I am specifically focusing on in this point. I guess this point and number 3 are both sort of like theological responses, but in this one I'm thinking particularly of his theology of exile. So a week ago I was at a workshop at Western Seminary. So every month people from Hope's religion department and theologians at Western Seminary get together to share research. It's one of these interinstitutional collegiality things that we do. And so a scholar from Western Seminary, Alberto La Rosa Rojas, I think is his name, he was speaking about his own experience as an immigrant from Peru and this theology of exile. And what Alberto said to him is that people often say to him, yeah, we're all exiles, right? Like, I understand your feeling because we're all experiencing the same feeling of exile, kind of Calvin's point. And Alberto said his own response to that was, well, actually, we are kind of different. And that he has this longing for home and for a place of homemaking that he feels like that theology doesn't always recognize, that theology doesn't always recognize the exile's longing for home or the refugee's longing for home. And so one thing that prompted me to think about was how these theologies of homemaking and exile might land differently based on one's social location, based on whether someone is native or refugee. And for refugee, there might be a real value to emphasizing the homes that God makes in this present world and allows us to make, and the ongoing theme of home in Scripture and homemaking in Scripture. But for those who are native, you might say, or maybe in the Dutch West Michigan context, those who are like after a couple of generations native, then we might need to hear a message of exile, of being willing to let your home be a little distant from us. Let it be a place that maybe almost feels like exile because it's changing, because new people come in. So I think that there are ways to use this language of exile and home that might speak differently to different populations. And those of us who have maybe too strong an attachment to our home being the same and never changing and always being the way that it is, we might need to hear this language of exile as a place that we are in to open us up to making our home be different as it welcomes outsiders. So I think that's a slightly different theological response than the one that landed in Calvin's time that Alberto's talk made me think about. And then the third thing that I think is really helpful from Calvin's response that I think is important to emphasize today is this theology of interdependence as fundamental to human nature, that we are all part of one humanity, that we all rely on one humanity, that we can't separate ourselves out and say that what happens to one person is not going to affect another person. This is true, I think, of the body of Christ. I also think it's true of the global human community. We can't just think about our own neighborhoods or our own states or our own countries. So this interdependence as basic to human nature, I think, has to be the foreground of any of our thinking about refugees and immigration, especially as we anticipate the next few decades. The expectation is that immigration crises, refugee crises, are only going to increase, largely because of climate change, but of course for all the same reasons that we have these crises, have had these crises in the past as well. So economic crises, famine, war, all those things continue, but you throw climate change in the mix and the difficulty of living in places that are very populated today, maybe 20 or 30 years from now. Refugee crises, immigration crises are not going away. So I think there is something here to be learned from Calvin that maybe we can take forward. I'll stop there. We have about 10 minutes. What questions do you have, or thoughts, comments?
What if you are exiled in your own home?
Yeah.
And that's my experience.
Yeah.
I wish to thank you for a splendid presentation of Calvin. You do honor to the history of Third Church and its association with Calvin. Back in 1967, when I first started to teach church history overseas, a student at Western Seminary and a member of Third Church, Paul Sweats by name, had the temerity to write to a famous Swiss author and tell him that his seminary class was coming to Geneva. The author, whose name I've forgotten, invited us to join him in the consistory room of the classis of Geneva, and he spoke to us of the heritage of that city. Thank you for a wonderful presentation this morning.
Well, thank you. I actually have my own Geneva story, which I can share in a moment, but I want to sort of comment on both of these. The exile in your own home, I think, is another dimension to these themes of displacement, because in this situation, the Palestinian situation, it's the outside oppression and the taking over of a native homeland in a way of violence that is very different, I think, from what was happening in Calvin's Geneva. So in that situation, and I think in much of the United States today, you have people who are marginalized and have very few resources coming into a place and seeking a new home. And here you're talking about the kind of reverse, people who have incredible power coming to a marginalized population. So it's almost the exact reverse. But I mean, that's striking to say, a kind of exile in your own home. I'm going to have to ponder that more. So yeah, thank you for that suggestion. Real quick, my story about Geneva. So when I was in college, I did a study abroad and took some time to, backpack and travel on my own. I went to Geneva. It was a gorgeous city. I loved it. I was already studying religion, interested in the Reformation, and I saw that they had a museum of the Reformation. I was like, well, I've got to go to this. That's super exciting. And I couldn't find it, and in my very poor French, I tried to ask someone where it was. The problem with having poor French is you might be able to ask a question and not understand the response, which is exactly what happened. But I eventually did find this museum, and the person in charge had to actually open it for me, because even though it was open hours, there's so little interest in the Museum of the Reformation that you have to have it open by request. So he's going around turning on all the lights, and I'm the only one looking around at all these texts from Calvin and Luther, original manuscripts and everything. It was a delight, but also noteworthy that literally no one else was interested in that museum that day. So yeah.
In the early 70s, I was a draftee, and as an alternative to dodging bullets in Vietnam, I got 6 years in the nuclear Navy, where I had to learn something about everything in the engine room. Coming to Hope after that, learning to be a family doctor, I learned a lot about people. I had grown up in this city where for 100 years it was a blend of Dutch and Latino culture. But in the 80s, a lot of churches brought in Southeast Asian families. And I had to learn their belief systems, including how they can act like a Christian but have Buddha on the table at home. A lot to learn. Yeah.
So you had some of that intercultural tension, yeah, in another situation too. These issues are very human issues, obviously, yeah. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you a question, Angela, since I have this microphone.
Sure.
Just help us understand why so many people were on the move in the 16th century.
Yeah, so this is the time of reform, and in much of Europe during this time, the Reformation went by state or political region. So whatever the political ruler of a particular state or region said about religion, that was the religion of that area. But within, you would have, committed Catholics or those committed to Reformed Christianity, and they are no longer welcome in their home. And by no longer welcome, like in France, they were cutting out people's tongues and burning them at the stake. So they, felt the need to leave, but that wasn't just France. It was everywhere. You might be more familiar with the English history, where you go from Queen Mary, who's called Bloody Mary, the Catholic, then to Elizabeth, the Protestant. And just in the same country, the switch of those political rulers meant at one point you were at home, and at another point you weren't, depending on your own faith commitment. So refugees throughout Europe are just like constantly moving. So Geneva, it wasn't only French refugees. Italian, Polish, English are also passing through. Yeah.
I have a question. Would those French Reformed Christians be considered Huguenots, or is that
Yes.
a different
Yeah.
point? Okay.
Yeah, Huguenot was pretty much used interchangeably at this
Okay.
time. Although my understanding of the history is that a lot of the Huguenots traced their religious sympathies to beliefs prior to Luther, so that it might have been an independent reform movement who, after Luther, sort of identify with the Reformation. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question about Geneva. The refugees who came spoke French. In Geneva, they spoke French.
Yes.
Nationalism was not a big thing
Right.
then. It was the city sort of protection of your economic interests and all that. So that seemed to be very different from now, where we have refugees who come, who have a different culture, who speak a different language. It's a different kind of threat that we deal with today.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important difference. Although there were slight differences in the French that was spoken in Geneva and the French spoken in France. So there would still have been an ability to distinguish people based on how they were speaking, even though they were speaking the same language, so dialect and accent and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that it's, in that case, not necessarily the kinds of cultural upheaval that in a globalized society we have much more of today. Although Geneva, as I said, was seeing refugees from England, from Poland, from Italy, so there were non-French speaking refugees. Most of the ones that Calvin is working with who are staying are French speaking refugees. So yeah, it's an important distinction. Thank you.
All right, I think our time is up, but we really thank you, Angela, for
Thanks for having me. It's been fun to be here.